On this episode of Elder Scrolls 6 Theories, we're going to be talking about the possible setting of Cyrodiil, or the Imperial Province. Now, as we do know, it was the setting for Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, but we're going to go into that a bit more in detail, and I hope you enjoy the video. So, first things first, I kind of want to go through the history and the lore of Cyrodiil so we can really get into what it's about, and it'll also add a bit of context to it. So, the first real mention of Cyrodiil is in the First Era, when the Ayleids, which are also known as Wild Elves, which is kind of another variation of the Aldmer, basically went and they discovered Cyrodiil, and they ruled over it. So, things really do start to get interesting when the Nemdic people are basically the early Nords in Skyrim, decide to head south. Now, this means that they are now in Cyrodiil along with the Ayleids, and everything's okay for a short amount of time. Well, everything's okay until the Night of Tears. Now, this is basically when the Snow Elves, another race of elf which reside in Skyrim along with the Nords, massacred the Nords of Skyrim. It's a long list of reasons why this happened, but basically the elves decided to kill them because they thought that their race was under threat. Of course, a couple of years after the Night of Tears, something called the Return happens, which is when Ysgramor and his two sons and the 500 companions all come back to Skyrim and start massacring the hell out of the Snow Elves. But around this time, the Ayleids decided that it's probably not a good idea to have the Nemdic people, who are, after all, well, distantly related, well, quite closely related to the Nords, in their lands. And for this reason, the Ayleids actually enslaved the Nemdic people. Now, I don't want to go into this subject too much because it's quite extensive, but the Ayleids worshipped the Altmer divines, but they also tangled with Daedric princes, which kept their slaves in line. So you can imagine it's going to be quite brutal if they're calling on people like Molag Bal to go and, treat with their slaves. Now, it is important to remember at this point Skyrim is pretty much under the control of the Nords, who worship their own form of divines. Now, they're not necessarily the 8 divines that we know today, but see them as kind of like the base deities. Anyway, it's important to note that a slave called Alicia in Cyrodiil prays to these divines, in particularly Kirinef, and strangely enough, Kirinef answers. Now, it's important to note that the divines that the Nords worship too seem to like humans a lot more than they like Myr, and for this reason, Kirinef sends her demigod son to kick some Ayleid ass. Okay, when I say kick ass, I actually more mean advise. Anyway, he kind of inherited Alicia's thoughts, and basically helped rally the other slaves to her cause, as well as this Kirinef kind of gave Alicia visions on how she could defeat her masters. And basically, one thing led to another, and Alicia was the queen of the slaves. She basically led a huge uprising against the Ayleids. So, at this point, you've got all-out war in Cyrodiil. You've got the Ayleids fighting a losing battle against Alicia's rebel army, who were, of course, aided by a demigod, an actual god, and another demigod who's believed to be the son of Lorcan. As well as this, of course, the Nords from Skyrim wasted little time in joining the fight, and pretty soon, basically, the Ayleids were forced inland towards the White Gold Tower, which at this point is their kind of chief monastery. Anyway, one thing led to another, and the siege of the White Gold Tower happened, which ultimately led to Elisa's victory, which basically meant she was the first Empress of Cyrodiil, and that's where it all starts. Anyway, Elisa went on to found the First Empire, which goes pretty well, but the really interesting thing happens on her deathbed. Basically, Lorcan arrives with a pact from Akatosh, who's one of the 8 divines, the dragon god, if you will. Basically, the deal means that Lorcan puts some of his divine blood into Elisa's amulet, or the Amulet of Kings. Akatosh then sealed off the plains of Oblivion, which basically stopped the Aedra and Daedra from ever walking on Nirn again. And it's kind of important to remember at this point that during the very, First Era, the earlier parts of it, the Aedra and the Daedra were still pretty much kicking around quite regularly on Nirn. It was a lot easier for them to get in and out. Of course, this leads us to the events of Oblivion, but I'm not going to go through them. So, Cyrodiil's always been the home of the Empire. For example, Tiber Septa knew if he was to go and take control, he had to have control in Cyrodiil. The Falmor knew that if they wanted to take control of the Empire, they had to hit it at its core in Cyrodiil. So let's talk a bit more about Cyrodiil, as if that is going to be the setting, surely we want to know more about it. Well, straight away with some good news, Cyrodiil is the second largest country in Tamriel, second of course to Morrowind. As well as that, being in the centre of Tamriel, it has a lot of different biomes and climates. For example, in the south, it's a lot more tropical. You also get some swampy areas coming in from the Black Marsh direction. And of course, it's more mountainous in the north and towards the western areas. So, you get a pretty decent mix. Being such a large country, it also has many different counties and cities. It actually has 9 in total, similar to the 9 holds and cities of Skyrim. But of course, these cities tend to be significantly larger. It has the Imperial City, which we'll talk about in a minute. That's the capital of Cyrodiil and of the Empire. It's also what houses the White Gold Tower. Now, the other cities are Anvil, Bravil, Bruma, Quarrel, Shadenal, Kvatch, Leowin, and Skingrad. So, there's a decent amount of cities. Now, something that I personally really do quite love about Cyrodiil is its architecture. I know I'd go on about this kind of stuff in most episodes, but Cyrodiil's architecture really is quite beautiful. It also has a great range. Some parts may remind you of more kind of medieval sort of looking fortresses, especially to the northern parts. But in the south and the west, there's these wonderful white buildings which kind of look like Roman villas. They're very nice. It's got a great range, so we wouldn't be stuck with just a consistent looking kind of building. But it would be really, really interesting. Of course, the cities are also really interesting because of the huge amounts of culture that the Imperials have, not only from the Aliens and the early Empire, but so many different races have been in Cyrodiil that basically they've all kind of left their little mark on its architecture. For example, the White Gold Tower was actually made by the Aliens. That's why it's got such a weird and interesting design. Now, being in the centre of Tamriel means that it's fairly land-based, which means there's not much ocean around it. There's a small amount between Hammerfell and Valenwood towards the west or the southwest, and there's a tiny bit towards the south between Elsewhere and Blackmarsh. But really, Cyrodiil's main source of water comes through the Nibun River, which is basically the large river that cuts straight through the middle of Cyrodiil and leads straight up to go around the Imperial City, which is the small island in the centre. Now, the idea of it being in the centre is quite a good thing as well, because it means that all of the different races will have a place there. For example, in previous games such as Skyrim, it wouldn't make sense for Wood Elves to be all the way in Skyrim, or Khajiit, or Argonians, because it's so far away, it's so different to their natural habitat, if you will. So for that reason, with Cyrodiil having so many different biomes and all of the different temperatures, and it just being surrounded by all the other races, means that you can expect a large amount of variation in the kind of, creatures that we'll see around there. Well, when I say creatures, I mean races, so Khajiit, elves, Redguards, Nords. Now, I'm not going to go into all the different 9 cities there, because there's a lot of them. So, I'm just going to focus on the main one, the Imperial City. That is the seat of the Empire on Tamriel. Now, the Imperial Cities where both the Emperor and his Elder Council rule over both Cyrodiil and the Empire, and for this reason it's very prestigious. The White Gold Tower in the centre, as we do know, it was built by the Aliens. The city also has a great amount of other things, such as the Talos Plaza district, which is basically a plaza which is dedicated to Talos, or I think he was the 3rd or 4th founder of the Empire. But obviously the elves don't exactly love that. But the elves have got things as well, such as the Elven Gardens district and the Temple district. As well as that, the Imperial City's home to the Arcane University, so if you thought the Mages College in Skyrim was good, then you will love this, because, it's even better. As well as that, they do have a pretty badass arena district, which, you can go in there and fight to get gold, which is pretty cool when you think about it, because we didn't really have anything like that in Skyrim. Although the White Gold Tower is probably the best preserved, or was the best preserved piece of Ayleid ruins, there's tons all around Cyrodiil, so you could probably see them as like the Dwemer ruins if you're only familiar with Skyrim, because, well, there aren't really any Dwemer ruins in Cyrodiil. Now, one of the really interesting things that I personally love about Cyrodiil that maybe we didn't see that much of in Elder Scrolls 4 was the animals. Now, although there were a huge range of them in Elder Scrolls 4, not all of them would be, because a lot of the encounters and creatures in Elder Scrolls 4 were actually Daedric, so they're not actually native to Cyrodiil. But you, of course, get all the standard things: wolf, deer, bears, boar. But as well as that, we get some quite interesting stuff, such as wraiths, trolls, spriggans, obviously slaughterfish, skeletons, ogres, interestingly enough, a lot of goblins, so you can expect things like packs of goblins, mountain lions, even minotaurs, which are really quite interesting. There's a lot of horses. There's things such as imps, which can not really be that dangerous, but they can be quite annoying. Zombies, all different kinds of really, really interesting creatures. If you want to know more about them, I'd go and read them individually, but there's tons of them, and for that reason, Cyrodiil really does peak, because due to the fact it's got a lot of different kind of parts, a lot of different biomes, it means that it's got a lot of different creatures in a lot of different areas. So if you enjoy exploring and seeing all different kinds of animals, then Cyrodiil will be a really, really good one for you to play with. Now, one of the things that really does kind of draw me to the idea of Cyrodiil is the fact that we'd be a lot closer to the Legion, which of course is really interesting because it's by far the most competent of fighting forces in Tamriel, and for that reason I'd really like to see more development on that. For example, just having things with higher health doesn't necessarily make them interesting, but if we did actually get to go to Cyrodiil and get to see things such as the Legion in an actual war zone, not just tiny little battles like what we got in Skyrim when they were taking a city, I just think that would be very interesting. As well as that, there's tons of different ideas. For example, wars going on, the Legion will be there. So you can expect a lot of things such as Legion quests. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is storyline potential. So there's a lot of potential for Cyrodiil being the heart of the Empire, both past and present. So, for example, you've got all of the different empires been founded there. You could set a game there, and I don't think anyone would bat an eyelid, because it's very interesting time periods. But, of course, a lot of these empire foundings involve you going to other places, so I think I'll have to talk about that in another video. So, in more current events, one of the most interesting things will, of course, be this Great War, which consists of the Aldmeri Dominion trying to take power from the Empire. Now, this is really, really interesting because it really has changed Tamriel on a whole, but nowhere more than Cyrodiil. For example, majority of the fighting took place in Cyrodiil. The White Gold Tower was smashed to pieces, like very heavily damaged after the Aldmeri sink their fingers into it. So for that reason, the Imperial City is pretty much in ruin. As well as that, I reckon that a lot of the Imperials will have a lot of hatred for the Elves, so we may be facing another civil war thing going on. Of course, that's not saying that we couldn't take off from the events of Skyrim, who knows? Depending on if the Stormcloaks won or if the Stormcloaks lost and it was an Imperial victory, it would affect it, but it's important to remember that Hammerfell is in open rebellion right now, and a lot of Nords would still really hate the Empire, so who's to say that we wouldn't be seeing a second invasion of Cyrodiil? So maybe we'd have a Nord and Redguard alliance along with some of the other races trying to take Cyrodiil back, and then the Empire trying to hold them back, or maybe the Aldmeri Dominions trying to retake Cyrodiil and trying to win the Great War again, and it's just another giant war, which would be really, really interesting in terms of a setting. As well as that, there's multiple other events that happen, and that's just the lore that we know, so really, in terms of storyline, there's very few places better than Cyrodiil. Now to my final point, which has probably been annoying a fair few people throughout the episode. Elder Scrolls 4 was set in Cyrodiil. Why the hell would I want to go back there? Well, that's a very good question. Obviously, like all games, Cyrodiil did have its flaws in Elder Scrolls Oblivion, but that's definitely not to say it wasn't a good game. It had very strong DLCs, and considering the technologies at hand, the graphics were pretty damn good. despite some of the characters looking a bit misshapen. It had the key features to make an Elder Scrolls game. It was the bread and butter that Skyrim was built upon, and it was very successful. And for that reason, I don't just want them to go and do a Redux. What I mean by that is don't just go and stick some new textures and some new models on it and try to clear it off as a new game. If they were going to set it in Cyrodiil, they would pretty much have to make it look more aesthetically pleasing and make some definite differences. So, for example, if they made it take place in the time of the Great War, make it look war-torn. As well as that, it's important to know that with all of our new technologies, it could be a lot more interesting. For example, larger cities, more people, just basically making the Cyrodiil area more like Cyrodiil in the lore. As well as that, it would be a crime to just go and try to redo the storyline from Oblivion. So, yeah, it definitely has the potential to make a pretty good Elder Scrolls game if the people who make it play their cards right and don't just try to redo what was already a good game. So, it's reached that pivotal point in every episode. Do I think that Elder Scrolls 6 should be set in Cyrodiil? Well, no. Although it's a great idea, and I do like Cyrodiil, it's a very interesting place. I think that it would be playing it incredibly safe to just go and set it in a place where the game before the last was set. And for that reason, I don't think that it would be the best place to set it, with so many other interesting places to set the next game. Although I don't think it would be a terrible idea, because Cyrodiil is by far one of the more interesting provinces on Tamriel, but it's just the simple fact that they previously did it not all that long ago. In fact, less than 10 years, and although I would have let it slide for something such as Morrowind, I feel as if Oblivion is still too fresh in our minds. Although Oblivion does kind of give us all of the really good core basics, and Cyrodiil is very nicely portrayed, and I do admit I would be very interested in seeing it in the light that all of the new technologies could offer, I feel as if to set it there would be a mistake on their behalf, unless they can pull a rabbit out of a hat and really give us an amazing, dazzling storyline with all beautiful and new scenery and really focus on immersion. Then I figure it could maybe work. But ultimately, I don't believe that they're going to try to do that. I think that they'll go for something unique and interesting that we haven't seen at all before, which we'll talk about in another episode. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.